Suddenly, the stag backed off and turned. Then, with a single bounding leap, he was gone among the trees. Martin Longbow chuckled and said, "Oh, just as well. It wouldn't do to have him become too friendly with men. Those antlers would quickly end up over some poacher's fireplace." Thomas whispered, "He's beautiful, Martin." Longbow nodded, his eyes still fastened upon the spot where the stag had vanished into the woods. "That he is, Thomas." Pug said, "I thought you hunted stags, Martin. How—" Martin said, "Old Whitebeard and I have something of an understanding, Pug. I hunt only bachelor stugs without does, or does too old to carve. When Whitebeard loses his harem to some younger buck some day, I may take him. Now, each leaves the other to his own way. The day will come when I look at him down the shaft of an arrow." He smiled at the boys. "I won't know until then if I shall let the shaft fly. Perhaps I will, perhaps not." He fell silent for a time, as if the thought of Whitebeard's becoming old was saddening. Then, as a light breeze rustled the branches, said, "Now, what brings two such bold hunters into the Duke's woods in the early morning? There must be 1,000 things left undone with the midsummer festival this afternoon." Thomas answered, "My mother tossed us out of the kitchen. We were more trouble than not. With the choosing today—" His voice died away, and he felt suddenly embarrassed. Much of Martin's mysterious reputation stemmed from when he first came to Criddy. At his time for the choosing, he had been placed directly with the old huntmaster by the Duke, rather than standing before the assembled craftmasters with the other boys his age. This violation of one of the oldest traditions known had offended many people in town, though none would dare openly express such feelings to Lord Borwick. As was natural, Martin became the object of their ire rather than the Duke. Over the years, Martin had more than justified Lord Borwick's decision, but still most people were troubled by the Duke's special treatment of him that one day. Even after 12 years, some people still regarded Martin Longbow as being different, and as such worthy of distrust. Thomas said, "I'm sorry, Martin." Martin nodded in acknowledgement, but without humour. "I understand, Thomas. I may not have had to endure your uncertainty, but I have seen many others wait for the day of choosing. And for 4 years I myself have stood with the other masters, so I know a little of your worry." A thought struck Pug, and he blurted, "But you're not with the other craftmasters." Martin shook his head, a rueful expression playing across his even features. "I had thought that, in light of your worry, you might fail to observe the obvious, but you've a sharp wit about you, Pug." Thomas didn't understand what they were saying for a moment. Then comprehension dawned. "Then you'll select no apprentices?" Martin raised a finger to his lips. "Not a word, lad. No. With young Garrett chosen last year, I've a full company of trackers." Thomas was disappointed. He wished more than anything to serve service with Swordmaster Fannon, but should he not be chosen as a soldier, then he would prefer the life of a forester under Martin. Now his second choice was denied him. After a moment of dark brooding, he brightened. Perhaps Martin didn't choose him because Fannon already had. Seeing his friend entering a cycle of elation and depression as he considered all the possibilities, Pug said, "You haven't been in the keep for nearly a month, Martin." He put away the sling he still held and asked, "Where have you kept yourself?" Martin looked at Pug as the boy instantly regretted his question. As friendly as Martin could be, he was still Huntmaster, a member of the Duke's household, and keep boys did not make a habit of questioning the coming and goings of the Duke's staff. Martin relieved Pug's embarrassment with a slight smile. I've been to Elvendar. Queen Aglorana had ended her 20 years of mourning the death of her husband, the Elf King. There was a great celebration. Pug was surprised by the answer. To him, as to most people in Criddy, the elves were little more than legend. But Martin had spent his youth near the elven forests, and was one of the few humans to come and go through those forests to the north at will. It was another thing that set Martin Longbow apart from others. While Martin had shared elvish lore with the boys before, this was the first time in Pug's memory he had spoken of his relationship to the elves. Pug stammered, "You feasted with the Elf Queen?" Martin assumed a pose of modest inconsequence. "Well, I sat at the table farthest from the throne, but yes, I was there." Seeing the unasked questions in their eyes, he continued, "You know, as a boy I was raised by the monks of Silban's Abbey, near the Elven Forest. I played with elven children, and before I came here, I hunted with Prince Caelin and his cousin Galain." Thomas nearly jumped with excitement. Elves were a subject holding particular fascination for him. "Did you know King Aidan?" Martin's expression clouded, and his eyes narrowed, his manner suddenly becoming stiff. Thomas saw Martin's reaction and said, "I'm sorry, Martin. Did I say something wrong?" Martin waved away the apology. "No fault of yours, Thomas," he said, his manner softening somewhat. "The elves do not use the names of those who have gone to the Blessed Isles, especially those who have died untimely. They believe to do so recalls those spoken of from their journey there, denying them their final rest. I respect their beliefs. Well, to answer you, no, I never met him. He was killed when I was only a small boy, but I've heard the stories of his deeds, and he was a good and wise king by all accounts." Martin looked about. "It approaches noon. We should return to the keep." He began to walk toward the path, and the boys fell in beside him. "What was the feast like, Martin?" asked Thomas. Pug sighed as the hunter began to speak of the marvels of Elvendar. He was also fascinated by tales of the elves, but to nowhere near the degree Thomas was. Thomas could endure hours of tales of the people of the elven forests, regardless of the speaker's credibility. At least, Pug considered, in the Huntmaster they had a dependable eyewitness. Martin's voice droned on, and Pug's attention wandered, as he again found himself pondering the choosing. No matter that he told himself worry was useless, he worried. He found he was facing the approaching of this afternoon with something akin to dread. The boys stood in the courtyard. It was midsummer, the day that ended one year and marked the beginning of another. Today, everyone in the castle would be counted 1 year older. For the Milling boys, this was significant, for today was the last day of their boyhood. Today was the choosing. Pug tugged at the collar of his new tunic. It wasn't really new, being one of Thomas's old ones, but it was the newest Pug had ever owned. Magyar, Thomas's mother, had taken it for the smaller boy to ensure he was presentable before the Duke and his court. Magyar and her husband Megar, the cook, were as close to being parents to the orphan as anyone in the keep. They tended his ills, saw that he was fed, and boxed his ears when he deserved it. They also loved him as if he were Thomas's brother. Pug looked around. The other boys all wore their best, for this was one of the most important days of their young lives. Each would stand before the assembled craftmasters and members of the Duke's staff, and each would be considered for an apprentice's post. It was a ritual, its origins lost in time, for the choices had already been made. The crafters and the Duke's staff had spent many hours discussing each boy's merits with one another, and knew which boys they would call. The practice of having the boys between 8 and 13 years of age work in the crafts and services had proved a wise course over the years in fitting the best suited to each craft.
In addition, it provided a pool of semi-skilled individuals for the other crafts, should the need arise. The drawback to the system was that certain boys were not chosen for a craft or staff position. Occasionally, there would be too many boys for a single position, or no lad judged fit, even though there was an opening. Even when the numbers of boys and openings seemed well matched, as it did this year, there were no guarantees. For those who stood in doubt, it was an anxious time. Pug scuffed his bare feet absently in the dust. Unlike Thomas, who seemed to do well at anything he tried, Pug was often guilty of trying too hard and bungling his tasks. He looked around and noticed that a few of the other boys also showed signs of tension. Some were joking roughly, pretending no concern over whether they were chosen or not. Others stood like Pug, lost in their thoughts, trying not to dwell on what they would do should they not be chosen. If he was not chosen, Pug, like the others, would be free to leave Criddy to find a craft in another town or city. If he stayed, he would have to either farm the Duke's land as a franklin or work one of the town's fishing boats. Both prospects were equally unattractive, but he couldn't imagine leaving Criddy. Pug remembered what Meggar had told him the night before. The old cook had cautioned him about fretting too much over the choosing. After all, he had pointed out, there were many apprentices who never advanced to the rank of journeyman, and when all things were taken into account, there were more men without craft in Criddy than with. Meggar had glossed over the fact that many fishers' and farmers' sons forsook the choosing, electing to follow their fathers. Pug wondered if Meggar was so removed from his own choosing he couldn't remember that the boys who were not chosen would stand before the assembled company of craftmasters, householders, and newly chosen apprentices under their gaze until the last name was called, and they were dismissed in shame. Biting his lower lip, Pug tried to hide his nervousness. He was not the sort to jump from the heights of sailor's grief should he not be chosen, as some had done in the past, but he couldn't bear the idea of facing those who had been chosen. Thomas, who stood next to his shorter friend, threw Pug a smile. He knew Pug was fretting, but could not feel entirely sympathetic as his own excitement mounted. His father had admitted that he would be the first called by Swordmaster Fannon. Moreover, the Swordmaster had confided that should Thomas do well in training, he might be found a place in the Duke's personal guard. It would be a signal honour and would improve Thomas's chance for advancement, even earning him an officer's rank after 15 or 20 years in the guard. He poked Pug in the ribs with an elbow, for the Duke's herald had come out onto the balcony overlooking the courtyard. The herald signalled to a guard, who opened the small door in the great gate, and the craftmasters entered. They crossed to stand at the foot of the broad stairs of the keep. As was traditional, they stood with their backs to the boys, waiting upon the Duke. The large oaken doors of the keep began to swing out ponderously, and several guards in the Duke's brown and gold darted through to take up their positions on the steps. Upon each tabard was emblazoned the golden gull of Criddy, and above that a small golden crown, marking the Duke a member of the royal family. The herald shouted, "Hearken to me! His Grace, Boric Condwine, 3rd Duke of Criddy, Prince of the Kingdom, Lord of Criddy, Cars and Tulan, Warden of the West, Knight General of the King's armies, heir presumptive to the throne of Rhiannon." The Duke stood patiently while the list of offices was completed, then stepped forward into the sunlight. Past 50, the Duke of Criddy still moved with the fluid grace and powerful step of a born warrior. Except for the grey at the temples of his dark brown hair, he looked younger than his age by 20 years. He was dressed from neck to boot in black, as he had been for the last 7 years, for he still mourned the loss of his beloved wife, Catherine. At his side hung a black scabbarded sword with a silver hilt, and upon his hand his ducal signet ring, the only ornamentation he permitted himself. The herald raised his voice. "Their Royal Highnesses, the Princes Liam Condwan and Arathar Condwan, heirs to the House of Criddy, Knight Captains of the King's Army of the West, Princes of the Royal House of Rillanon." Both sons stepped forward to stand behind their father. The two young men were 6 and 4 years older than the apprentices, the Duke having wed late. But the difference between the awkward candidates for apprenticeship and the sons of the Duke was much more than a few years in age. Both princes appeared calm and self-possessed. Liam, the older, stood on his father's right, a blonde, powerfully built man. His open smile was the image of his mother's, and he looked always on the verge of laughter. He was dressed in a bright blue tunic and yellow leggings, and wore a closely trimmed beard as blonde as his shoulder-length hair. Arathar was to shadows and night as Liam was to light and day. He stood nearly as tall as his brother and father, but while they were powerfully built, he was rangy to the point of gauntness. He wore a brown tunic and russet leggings. His hair was dark and his face clean-shaven. Everything about Arathar gave one the feeling of quickness. His strength was in his speed with the rapier, speed with wit. His humour was dry and often sharp. While Liam was openly loved by the Duke's subjects, Arathar was respected and admired for his ability, but not regarded with warmth by the people. Together, the two sons seemed to capture most of the complex nature of their sire, for the Duke was capable of both Liam's robust humour and Arathar's dark moods. They were nearly opposites in temperament, but both capable men who would benefit the duchy and kingdom in years to come. The Duke loved both his sons. The herald again spoke. "The Princess Carline, daughter of the royal house." The slim and graceful girl who made her entrance was the same age as the boys who stood below, but already beginning to show the poise and grace of one born to rule and the beauty of her late mother. Her soft yellow gown contrasted strikingly with her nearly black hair. Her eyes were Liam's blue, as their mother's had been, and Liam beamed when his sister took their father's arm. Even Arathar ventured one of his rare half-smiles, for his sister was dear to him also. Many boys in the keep harboured a secret love for the princess, a fact she often turned to her advantage when there was mischief afoot. But even her presence could not drive the day's business from their minds. The Duke's court then entered. Pug and Thomas could see that all the members of the Duke's staff were present, including Culgan. Pug had glimpsed him in the castle from time to time since the night of the storm, and they had exchanged words once, Culgan inquiring as to his well-being, but mostly the magician was absent from sight. Pug was a little surprised to see the magician, for he was not properly considered a full member of the Duke's household, but rather a sometime adviser. Most of the time, Culgan was ensconced in his tower, hidden from view as he did whatever magicians do in such places. The magician was deep in conversation with Father Tully, a priest of Astalon the Builder, and one of the Duke's oldest aides. Tully had been adviser to the Duke's father, and had seemed old then. He now appeared ancient, at least to Pug's youthful perspective, but his eyes betrayed no sign of senility. Many a keep boy had been impaled upon the pointed gaze of those clear grey eyes. His wit and tongue were equally youthful, and more than once a keep boy had wished for a session with Horsemaster Algon's leather strap, rather than a tongue-lashing from Father Tully. The white-haired priest could nearly strip the skin from a miscreant's back with his caustic words. Nearby stood one who had experienced Tully's wrath upon occasion, Squire Roland, son of Baron Talbot of Toulan, one of the Duke's vassals. He was companion to both princes, being the only other boy of noble birth in the keep. His father had sent him to Criddy the year before, to learn something of the management of the duchy and the ways of the Duke's court. In the rather rough frontier court, Roland discovered a home away from home. He was already something of a rogue when he arrived, but his infectious sense of humour and ready wit often eased much of the anger that resulted from his prankish ways. It was Roland more often than not who was Princess Carline's accomplice in whatever mischief she was embarked upon. With light brown hair and blue eyes, Roland stood tall for his age. He was a year older than the gathered boys, and had often played with them over the last year, as Liam and Arthur were frequently busy with court duties. Thomas and he had been boyish rivals at first, then fast friends, with Pug becoming his friend by default, because where Thomas was, Pug was certain to be nearby. Roland saw Pug fidgeting near the edge of the assembled boys and gave him a slight nod and wink. Pug grinned briefly, for while he was as often the butt of Roland's jokes as any other, he still found himself liking the wild young squire. After all his court was in attendance, the Duke spoke. "Yesterday was the last day of the 11th year of the reign of our Lord King Roderick IV. Today is the festival of Banapis. The following day will find these boys gathered here counted among the men of Criddy, boys no longer, but apprentices and freemen. At this time, it is proper for me to inquire if any among you wishes to be released from service to the duchy. Are there any among you who so wish?" The question was formal in nature, and no response was expected, for few ever wished to leave Criddy. But one boy did step forward. The herald asked, "Who seeks release of his service?" The boy looked down, clearly nervous. Clearing his throat, he said, "I am Robert, son of Hugon." Pug knew him, but not well. He was a net mender's son, a town boy, and they rarely mixed with the keep boys. Pug had played with him upon a few occasions, and had a sense the lad was well regarded. It was a rare thing to refuse service, and Pug was as curious as any to hear the reasons. The Duke spoke kindly. "What is your purpose, Robert, son of Hugon?" "Your Grace, my father is unable to take me into his craft, for my 4 brothers are well able to ascend to the craft as journeymen and masters after him, as are many other netmenders' sons. My eldest brother is now married and has a son of his own, so my family no longer has room for me in the house. And if I may not stay with my family and practice my father's craft, I beg your Grace's leave to take service as a sailor." The Duke considered the matter. Robert was not the first village boy to be called by the lure of the sea. "Have you found a master willing to take you into his company?" "Yes, your Grace. Captain Gregson, master of the ship Green Deep from Margrave's Port, is willing." "I know this man," said the Duke, smiling slightly. He said, "He's a good and fair man. I recommend you into his service and wish you well in your travels. You will be welcomed at Criddy whenever you return with your ship." Robert bowed a little stiffly and left the courtyard, his part in the choosing done. Pug wondered at Robert's adventuresome choice. In less than a minute, the boy had renounced his ties with his family and home, and was now a citizen of a city he had never seen. It was custom that a sailor was considered to owe his loyalty to the city that was his ship's home port. Margrave's Port was one of the free cities of Natal, on the bitter sea, and was now Robert's home. The Duke indicated the herald should continue. The herald announced the first of the craftmasters, Sailmaker Home, who called the names of 3 boys. All 3 took service, and none seemed displeased. The choosing went smoothly, as no boy refused service. Each boy went to stand next to his new master. As the afternoon wore on, and the number of boys diminished, Pug became more and more uncomfortable. Soon there were only 2 boys beside Pug and Thomas standing in the centre of the court. All the craftmasters had called their apprentices, and only 2 of the Duke's household staff beside the swordmaster had not been heard from. Pug studied the group on the top of the steps, his heart pounding with anxiety. The 2 princes regarded the boys, Liam with a friendly smile, Arthur brooding on some thought or another. The Princess Carline was bored by the entire affair and took little pains to hide the fact, as she was whispering to Roland. This brought a disapproving look from Lady Marna, her governess. Horsemaster Algon came forth, his brown and golden tabard bearing a small horse head embroidered over his left breast. The horsemaster called the name of Rolf, son of Dick, and the stocky son of the Duke's stableman walked over to stand behind the master. When he turned, he smiled condescendingly at Pug. The 2 boys had never gotten along, the pock-scarred boy spending many hours taunting and tormenting Pug. While they both worked in the stable under Dick, the stableman had looked the other way whenever his son sprang a trap on Pug, and the orphan was always held responsible for any difficulty that arose. It had been a terrible period for Pug, and the boy had vowed to refuse service rather than face the prospect of working next to Rolf the rest of his life. Housecarl Samuel called the other boy Geoffrey, who had become a member of the castle's serving staff, leaving Pug and Thomas standing alone. Swordmaster Fannon then stepped forward, and Pug felt his heart stand still as the old soldier called, "Thomas, son of Megga." There was a pause, and Pug waited to hear his own name called, but Fannon stepped back, and Thomas crossed over to stand alongside him. Pug felt dwarfed by the gaze of all upon him. The courtyard was now larger than he had ever remembered it, and he felt ill-fashioned and poorly dressed. His heart sank in his chest as he realised that there was no craftmaster or staff member present who had not taken an apprentice. He would be the only boy uncalled. Fighting back tears, he waited for the Duke to dismiss the company. As the Duke started to speak, sympathy for the boy showing clearly in his face, he was interrupted by another voice.
"Your Grace, if you would be so kind."
All eyes turned to see Culgan, the magician, step forward.
"I have need of an apprentice, and would call Pug, orphan of the keep, to service."
A wave of murmuring swept.
We've all been there. A speeding ticket. And not just any speeding ticket. A speeding ticket while on a trip abroad. And that comes with all kinds of problems, like late penalties and foreign language barriers, or government websites that only accept obscure ways of payment. It's time for a revolution. With PayTicket, your foreign parking ticket problems are a thing of the past. Simply input your information, such as name, email, and country of residence. Take a quick photo of your ticket, plug in your credit card details, and click Send. And PayTicket will take care of the rest. No matter what kind of traffic or parking violation you may have to pay, PayTicket makes it easier. Simple, fast, hassle-free. That's PayTicket.
That's all right. No, this is true.
Starting video templates. Each video maker is carefully designed to look professional. Our video makers are super easy to use and let anyone with an internet connection create high-quality videos in seconds. Edit logos, mockups, videos, and design templates with just a few clicks. Each template is carefully made by design experts, so your work will always look great. Get started with the best video maker at Plazy.net.
Through the assembled craftmasters, a few voices could be heard saying it wasn't proper for a magician to participate in the choosing. The Duke silenced them with a sweep of his gaze, his face stern. No craftmaster would challenge the Duke of Criddy, the third-ranking noble in the kingdom, over the standing of one boy. Slowly all eyes returned to regard the boy. The Duke said, "As Culgan is a recognized master of his craft, it is his right to choose. Pug, orphan of the keep, will you take service?" Pug stood rigid. He had imagined himself leading the king's army into battle as a knight lieutenant, or discovering someday he was the lost son of nobility. In his boyish imaginings, he had sailed ships, hunted great monsters, and saved the nation. In quieter moments of reflection, he had wondered if he would spend his life building ships, making pottery, or learning the trader's skill, and speculated on how well he would do in each of those crafts. But the one thing he never thought of, the one dream that had never captured his fantasies, was that of becoming a magician. He snapped out of his shocked state, aware the Duke patiently awaited his response. He looked at the faces of those before him. Father Tully gave him one of his rare smiles, as did Prince Aretha. Prince Liam nodded a slight yes, and Culgan regarded him intently. There were signs of worry upon the magician's face, and suddenly Pug decided. It might not be an entirely proper calling, but any craft was better than none. He stepped forward and caught his own heel with his other foot and landed face down in the dust. Picking himself up, he half-scrambled, half-ran to the magician's side. The misstep broke the tension, and the Duke's booming laughter filled the courtyard. Flushing with embarrassment, Pug stood behind Culgan. He looked around the broad girth of his new master and found the Duke watching, his expression tempered by a kind nod at the blushing Pug. The Duke turned back to those who stood waiting for the choosing to end. "I declare that each boy present is now the charge of his master, to obey him in all matters within the laws of the kingdom, and each shall be judged a true and proper man of Criddy. Let the apprentices attend their masters. Until the feasting, I bid you good day." He turned and presented his left arm to his daughter. She placed her hand lightly upon it, and they passed into the keep between the ranks of the courtiers, who drew aside. The two princes followed, and the others of the court. Pug saw Thomas leave in the direction of the guard barracks, behind Master Fannon. He turned his attention back to Culgan, who was standing lost in thought. After a moment, the magician said,
"I trust neither of us has made a mistake this day."
"Sir?" Pug asked, not understanding the magician's meaning. Culgan waved one hand absently, causing his pale yellow robe to move like waves rippling over the sea.
"It is no matter, boy. What's done is done. Let us make the best of things."
He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder.
"Come, let us retire to the tower where I reside. There is a small room below my own that should do for you. I had intended it for some project or another, but have never managed to find the time to prepare it."
Pug stood in awe. "A room of my own?" Such a thing for an apprentice was unheard of. Most apprentices slept in the workrooms of their master, or protected herds or the like. Only when an apprentice became a journeyman was it usual for him to take private quarters. Culgan arched one bushy eyebrow.
"Of course. Can't have you underfoot all the time. I'd never get anything done. Besides, magic requires solitude for contemplation. You will need to be untroubled as much as, or perhaps more than, I will."
He took out his long, thin pipe from a fold of his robe and started to stuff it full of tobacco from a pouch that had also come from within the robe.
"Let's not bother with too much discussion of duties and such, boy, for in truth I am not prepared for you. But in short order I will have things well in hand. Until then we can use the time by becoming acquainted with one another. Agreed?"
Pug was startled. He had little notion of what a magician was about, in spite of the night spent with Kulgan weeks ago. But he readily knew what craftmasters were like, and none would have thought to inquire whether or not an apprentice agreed with his plans. Not knowing what to say, Pug just nodded.
"Good then," said Kulgan. "Let us be off to the tower to find you some new clothes, and then we will spend the balance of the day feasting. Later there will be ample time to learn how to be master and apprentice."
With a smile for the boy, the stout magician turned Pug around and led him away. The late afternoon was clear and bright, with a gentle breeze from the sea cooling the summer heat. Throughout the keep of Castle Criddy and the town below, preparations for the festival of Banapis were in progress. Banapis was the oldest known holiday, its origins lost in antiquity. It was held each Midsummer's Day, a day belonging neither to the past year nor the coming year. Banapis, known by other names in other nations, was celebrated over the entire world of Midcamia, according to legend. It was believed by some that the festival was borrowed from the elves and dwarves, for the long-lived races were said to have celebrated the Feast of Midsummer as far back as the memory of both races could recall. Most authorities disputed this allegation, citing no reason other than the unlikelihood of humans borrowing anything from the elven or dwarven folk. It was rumoured that even the denizens of the Northlands, the goblin tribes and the clans of the Brotherhood of the Dark Path celebrated Banapis, though no one had ever reported seeing such a celebration. The courtyard was busy. Huge tables had been erected to hold the myriad varieties of food that had been in preparation for over a week. Giant barrels of dwarven ale imported from Stone Mountain had been hauled out of the cellars and were resting on protesting, overburdened wood frames. The workmen, alarmed at the fragile appearance of the barrel ricks, were quickly emptying some of the contents. Megar came out of the kitchen and angrily shooed them away.
"Leave off! There will be none left for the evening meal at this rate. Back to the kitchen, dolts! There is much work to be done yet."
The workers went off, grumbling, and Megar filled a tankard to ensure the ale was at proper temperature. After he drained it dry and satisfied himself that all was as it should be, he returned to the kitchen. There was no formal beginning to the feast. Traditionally, people and food, wine and ale all accumulated until they reached a certain density. Then, all at once, the festival would be in full swing. Pug ran from the kitchen. His room in the northmost tower, the Magician's Tower as it had become known, provided him with a shortcut through the kitchen, which he used rather than the main doors of the keep. He beamed as he sped across the courtyard in his new tunic and trousers. He had never worn such finery and was in a hurry to show his friend Thomas. He found Thomas leaving the soldiers' commons, nearly as much in a hurry as Pug. When the two met, they both spoke at once. "Look at the new tunic," said Pug. "Look at my soldier's tabard," said Thomas. Both stopped and broke into laughter. Thomas regained his composure first. "Those are very fine clothes, Pug," he said, fingering the expensive material of Pug's red tunic, "and the colour suits you." Pug returned the compliment, for Thomas did cut a striking figure in his brown and gold tabard. It was of little consequence that he wore his regular homespun tunic and trouser underneath. He would not receive a soldier's uniform until Master Phanom was satisfied with his worthiness as a man-at-arms. The two friends wandered from one heavily laden table to another. Pug's mouth watered from the rich fragrances in the air. They came to a table heaped with meat pies, steam rising from their hot crusts, pungent cheeses, and hot bread. At the table, a young kitchen boy was stationed with a shoe fly. His job was to keep pests from the food, whether of the insect variety or the chronically hungry apprentice variety. Like most other situations involving boys, the relationship between this guardian of the feast and the older apprentices was closely bound by tradition. It was considered ill-mannered and in poor taste merely to threaten or bully the smaller boy into parting with food before the start of the feast. But it was considered fair to use guile, stealth, or speed in gaining a prize from the table. Pug and Thomas observed with interest as the boy, named John, delivered a wicked whack to the hand of one young apprentice seeking to snag a large pie. With a nod of his head, Thomas sent Pug to the far side of the table. Pug ambled across John's field of vision, and the boy watched him carefully. Pug moved abruptly, a feint towards the table, and John leaned in his direction. Then, suddenly, Thomas snatched a puff pastry from the table and was gone before the shoe-fly lash began to descend. As they ran from the table, Pug and Thomas could hear the distressed cries of the boy whose table they had plundered. Thomas gave Pug half the pie when they were safely away, and the smaller apprentice laughed. "You're the quickest hand in the castle, I bet." Or young John was slow of eye for keeping it on you. They shared a laugh. Pug popped his half of the pie into his mouth. It was delicately seasoned, and the contrast between the salty pork filling and the sweet puff pastry crust was delicious. The sound of pipes and drums came from the side courtyard as the Duke's musicians approached the main courtyard. By the time they had emerged around the keep, a silent message seemed to pass through the crowd. Suddenly, the kitchen boys were busy handing out wooden platters for the celebrants to heap food upon, and mugs of ale and wine were being drawn from the barrels. The boys dashed to a place in line at the first table. Pug and Thomas used their size and quickness to good advantage, darting through the throng, snagging food of every description and a large mug of foamy ale each. They found a relatively quiet corner and fell to with ravenous hunger. Pug tasted his first drink of ale and was surprised at the robust, slightly bitter taste. It seemed to warm him as it went down, and, after another experimental taste, he decided that he liked it. Pug could see the Duke and his family mingling with the common folk. Other members of his court could also be seen standing in line before the tables. There was no ceremony, ritual, or rank observed this afternoon. Each was served as he arrived, for Midsummer's Day was the time when all would equally share in the bounties of the harvest. Pug caught a glimpse of the princess and felt his chest tighten a little. She looked radiant as many of the boys in the courtyard complimented her on her appearance. She wore a lovely gown of deep blue and a simple, broad-brimmed hat of the same colour. She thanked each author of a flattering remark and used her dark eyelashes and bright smile to good advantage, leaving a wake of infatuated boys behind. Jugglers and clowns made their appearance in the courtyard, the first of many groups of travelling performers who were in the town for the festival. The actors of another company had set up a stage in the town square and would give a performance in the evening. Until the early hours of the next morning, the festivities would continue. Pug knew that many of the boys the year before had to be excused duty the day following Bannerpiss, for their heads and stomachs were in no condition for honest work. He was sure that scene would be repeated tomorrow. Pug looked forward to the evening, for it was the custom for new apprentices to visit many of the houses in the town, receiving congratulations and mugs of ale. It was also a ripe time for meeting the town girls. While dalliance was not unknown, it was frowned upon. But mothers tended to be less vigilant during Bannerpiss. Now that the boys had crafts, they were viewed less as bothersome pests and more as potential sons-in-law. And there had been more than one case of a mother looking the other way while a daughter used her natural gifts to snare a young husband. Pug, being of small stature and youthful appearance, got little notice from the girls of the keep. Thomas, however, was more and more the object of girlish flirtation as he grew in size and good looks, and lately Pug had begun to be aware that his friend was being sized up by one or another of the castle girls. Pug was still young enough to think the whole thing silly, but old enough to be fascinated by it. Pug chewed an improbable mouthful and looked around. People from the town and keep passed, offering congratulations on the boys' apprenticeship and wishing them a good new year. Pug felt a deep sense of rightness about everything. He was an apprentice, even if Kulgan seemed completely unsure of what to do with him. He was well fed and on his way to being slightly intoxicated, which contributed to his sense of well-being. And, most important, he was among friends. There can't be much more to life than this, he thought. Chapter 3. Keep. Pug sat sulking on his sleeping pallet. Phantus the fire drake pushed his head forward, inviting Pug to scratch him behind his eye ridges. Seeing that he would get little satisfaction, the drake made his way to the tower window and, with a snort of displeasure, complete with a small puff of black smoke, launched himself in flight. Pug didn't notice the creatures leaving, so engrossed was he in his own world of troubles. Since he had taken on the position of Kulgan's apprentice 14 months ago, everything he had done seemed to go wrong. He lay back on the pallet, covering his eyes with a forearm. He could smell the salty sea breeze that blew in through his window and feel the sun's warmth across his legs. Everything in his life had taken a turn for the better since his apprenticeship, except the single most important thing: his studies. For months, Kulgan had been labouring to teach him the fundamentals of the magician's arts, but there was always something that caused his efforts to go awry. In the theories of spell casting, Pug was a quick study, grasping the basic concepts well. But each time he attempted to use his knowledge, something seemed to hold him back. It was as if part of his mind refused to follow through with the magic, as if a block existed that prevented him from passing a certain point in the spell. Each time he tried, he could feel himself approach that point and, like a rider of a balky horse, he couldn't seem to force himself over the hurdle. Kulgan dismissed his worries, saying that it would all sort itself out in time. The stout magician was always sympathetic with the boy, never reprimanding him for not doing better, for he knew the boy was trying. Pug was brought out of his reverie by someone's opening the door. Looking up, he saw Father Tully entering, a large book under his arm. The cleric's white robes rustled as he closed the door. Pug sat up.
"Pug, it's time for your writing lesson."
He stopped himself when he saw the downcast expression of the boy.
"What's the matter, lad?"
Pug had come to like the old priest of Astalon. He was a strict master, but a fair one. He would praise the boy for his success as often as scold him for his failures. He had a quick mind and a sense of humour, and was open to questions no matter how stupid Pug thought they might sound. Coming to his feet, Pug sighed. "I don't know, Father. It's just that things don't seem to be going right. Everything I try, I manage to make a mess of."
"Pug, it can't be all black,"
the priest said, placing a hand on Pug's shoulder.
"Why don't you tell me what it is troubling you, and we can practice writing some other time."
He moved to a stool by the window and adjusted his robes around him as he sat. As he placed the large book at his feet, he studied the boy. Pug had grown over the last year, but was still small. His shoulders were beginning to broaden a bit, and his face was showing signs of the man he would someday be. He was a dejected figure in his homespun tunic and trousers, his mood as grey as the material he wore. His room, which was usually neat and orderly, was a mess of scrolls and books, reflecting the disorder in his mind. Pug sat quietly for a moment, but when the priest said nothing, started to speak. Do you remember my telling you that Colgan was trying to teach me the 3 basic cantrips to calm the mind, so that the working of spells could be practiced without stress? Well, the truth is that I mastered those exercises months ago. I can bring my mind to a state of calm in moments now, with little effort. But that's as far as it goes. After that, everything seems to fall apart.
What do you mean?
Well, the next thing to learn is to discipline the mind to do things that are not natural for it, such as think on one thing to the exclusion of everything else, or not to think of something, which is quite hard once you've been told what it is. I can do those things most of the time, but now and again I feel like there are some forces inside my head crashing about, demanding that I do things in a different way. It's like there was something else happening in my head than what Colgan told me to expect. Each time I try one of the simple spells Colgan has taught me, like making an object move or lifting myself off the ground, these things in my head come flooding in on my concentration, and I lose my control. I can't even master the simplest spell. Pug felt himself tremble, for this was the first chance he had had to speak about this to anyone besides Colgan. Colgan simply says to keep at it and not worry. Nearing tears, he continued, I have talent. Colgan said he knew it from the first time we met when I used the crystal. You've told me that I have talent, but I just can't make the spells work the way they're supposed to. I get so confused by it all.
Pug, said the priest, magic has many properties, and we understand little of how it works, even those of us who practice it. In the temples, we are taught that magic is a gift from the gods, and we accept that on faith. We do not understand how this can be so, but we do not question. Each order has its own province of magic, with no two quite alike. I am capable of magic that those who follow their orders are not, but none can say why. Magicians deal in a different sort of magic, and their practices are very different from our practices in the temples. Much of what they do we cannot. It is they who study the art of magic, seeking its nature and workings, but even they cannot explain how magic works. They only know how to work it, and pass the knowledge along to their students, as Colgan is doing with you.
Trying to do with me, Father. I think he may have misjudged me.
I think not, Pug. I have some knowledge of these things, and since you have become Colgan's pupil, I have felt the power growing in you. Perhaps you will come to it late, as others have, but I am sure you will find the proper path.
Pug was not comforted. He didn't question the priest's wisdom or his opinion, but he did feel he could be mistaken. I hope you're right, Father. I just don't understand what's wrong with me.
I think I know what's wrong,
came a voice from the door. Startled, Pug and Father Tully turned to see Colgan standing in the doorway. His blue eyes were set in lines of concern, and his thick grey brows formed a V over the bridge of his nose. Neither Pug nor Tully had heard the door open. Colgan hiked his long green robe and stepped into the room, leaving the door open.
"Come here, Pug,"
said the magician, with a small wave of his hand. Pug went over to the magician, who placed both hands on his shoulders.
"Boys who sit in their rooms, day after day, worrying about why things don't work, make things not work. I am giving you the day for yourself. As it is 6th day, There should be plenty of other boys to help you in whatever sort of trouble boys can find.
He smiled, and his pupil was filled with relief.
You need a rest from study. Now go.
So saying, he fetched a playful cuff to the boy's head, sending him running down the stairs. Crossing over to the pallet, Culgan lowered his heavy frame to it and looked at the priest.
Boys,
said Culgan, shaking his head.
You hold a festival, give them a badge of craft, and suddenly they expect to be men. But they're still boys, and no matter how hard they try, they still act like boys, not men.
He took out his pipe and began filling it.
Magicians are considered young and inexperienced at 30. But in all other crafts, 30 would mark a man a journeyman or master, most likely readying his own son for the choosing.
He put a taper to the coals still smouldering in Pug's firepot and lit his pipe. Tully nodded.
I understand, Culgan. The priesthood also is an old man's calling. At Pug's age, I still had 13 years of being an acolyte before me.
The old priest leaned forward.
Culgan, what of the boy's problem?
The boy's right, you know,
Culgan stated flatly.
There is no explanation for why he cannot perform the skills I've tried to teach. The things he can do with scrolls and devices amaze me. The boy has such gifts for these things. I would have wagered he had the makings of a magician of mighty arts, but this inability to use his inner powers.
Do you think you can find a solution?
I hope so. I would hate to have to release him from apprenticeship. It would go harder on him than had I never chosen him.
His face showed his genuine concern.
It is confusing, Tully. I think you'll agree he has the potential for a great talent. As soon as I saw him use the crystal in my hut that night, I knew, for the first time in years, I might have at last found my apprentice. When no master chose him, I knew fate had set our paths to cross. But there is something else inside that boy's head, something I've never met before, something powerful. I don't know what it is, Tully, but it rejects my exercises as if they were somehow not correct or ill-suited to him. I don't know if I can explain what I've encountered with Pug any better. There is no simple explanation for it.
Have you thought about what the boy said?
Asked the priest, a look of thoughtful concern on his face.
You mean about my having been mistaken?
Tully nodded. Culgan dismissed the question with a wave of his hand.
Tully, you know as much about the nature of magic as I do, perhaps more. Your god is not called the god who brought order for nothing. Your sect unraveled much about what orders this universe. Do you for one moment doubt the boy has talent?
Talent, no. But his ability is the question for the moment.
Well put, as usual. Well then, have you any ideas? Should we make a cleric out of the boy, perhaps?
Tully sat back, a disapproving expression upon his face.
You know the priesthood is a calling, Culgan, he said stiffly.
Oh, put your back down, Tully. I was making a joke.
He sighed.
Still, if he hasn't the calling of a priest, nor the knack of a magician's craft, what can we make of this natural ability of his?
Tully pondered the question in silence for a moment, then said,
Have you thought of the lost art?
Culgan's eyes widened.
That old legend?
Tully nodded.
I doubt there is a magician alive who at one time or another hasn't reflected on the legend of the lost art. If it had existed, it would explain away many of the shortcomings of our craft.
Then he fixed Tully with a narrowed eye, showing his disapproval.
But legends are common enough. Turn up any rock on the beach and you'll find one. I, for one, prefer to look for real answers to our shortcomings, not blame them on ancient superstitions.
Tully's expression became stern and his tone scolding.
We of the temple do not count it legend, Kalgan. It is considered part of the revealed truth taught by the gods to the first men.
Nettled by Tully's tone, Kalgan snapped,
So was the notion the world was flat until Roland Dirk, a magician, I'll remind you, sent his magic sight high enough to disclose the curvature of the horizon, clearly demonstrating the world to be a sphere. It was a fact known by almost every sailor and fisherman who had ever seen a sail appear upon the horizon before the rest of the ship since the beginning of time.
His voice rose to a near shout. Seeing Tully was stung by the reference to ancient church canon long since abandoned, Kalgan softened his tone.
No disrespect to you, Tully, but don't try to teach an old thief to steal. I know your order chops logic with the best of them, and that half your brother clerics fall into laughing fits when they hear those deadly serious young acolytes debate theological issues set aside a century ago. Besides which, isn't the legend of the lost art an Aesculapian dogma?
Now it was Tully's turn to fix Kalgan with a disapproving eye. With a tone of amused exasperation, he said,
Your education in religion is still lacking, Kalgan, despite a somewhat unforgiving insight into the inner workings of my order.
He smiled a little.
You're right about the moot gospel courts, though. Most of us find them so amusing because we remember how painfully grim we were about them when we were acolytes.
Then, turning serious, he said, But I am serious when I say your education is lacking.
The Aesculapians have some strange beliefs, it's true, and they are an insular group. But they are also the oldest order known, and are recognized as the senior church in questions pertaining to interdenominational differences.
Religious wars, you mean?
Said Kalgan with an amused snort. Tully ignored the comment.
The Aesculapians are caretakers for the oldest lore and history in the kingdom, and they have the most extensive library in the kingdom. I have visited the library at their temple in Krondor, and it is most impressive.
Kalgan smiled, and with a slight tone of condescension said,
As have I, Tully, and I have browsed the shelves at the Abbey of Sarth, which is 10 times as large. What's the point?
Leaning forward, Tully said,
The point is this. Say what you will about the Aesculapians, but when they put forth something as history, not lore, they can usually produce ancient tomes to support their claims.
No.